Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Blogging Heads. I'm Eli Lake of the Washington Times and New Republic, and I'm with Heather Hurlburt, the Executive Director of the National Security Network. How are you today, Heather?
Pretty good, thanks, Eli. Recuperating from my day in the pumpkin patch yesterday.
Cool. Well, I had a pretty good weekend.
I heard you have a new joke.
It's not a joke. Well, all right. See, you can't set it up that way. But anyway, I was out with a group of friends, and there were like 11 of us at a restaurant, and I had to figure out the tip on this, fairly large bill, and it had to be 18%. It was an odd number with decimals, but it turns out I got it right. And then I woke up 2 days later, and I found out I won the Fields Medal. Anyway. You don't think that's funny? Okay.
I'm still back on why the tip had to be 18% and not 20, which is easier to figure out.
Well, no, because exactly, 20% is easier to figure out. Anyway, that's it. We're not going to talk about the Nobel Prize.
Okay, neither of us has a burgeoning second career as a comedian.
I think I could be a funny person. Anyway, but that's okay. All right.
I'm sure you're a funny person.
Okay.
But we actually wanted to talk about very serious matters this morning.
Super serious.
So our attempt at humor having been what it was.
The joke writes itself. Anyway. I'm not a big basher either. I'm just saying that,
So my question is, what are you going to do with your math skills now that you've won the prize?
Now that I've won the field.
Are you inspired to go out and fix mathematical illiteracy everywhere?
I'm just going to figure out everybody's tips. Anyway.
Well, that's a noble goal all by itself.
Or for my promise as a math scholar. Okay. So, joking aside, what do you want to start off with? Do you want to start off with Afghanistan?
Sure. I was going to say, you want to talk Israel and I want to talk Afghanistan. Two happy moments. So the bad news is, the good news is the discourse moved off the Nobel. The bad news is it moved on to the equally unedifying question of Afghanistan being just like Iraq, and all we have to do is put more troops in, just like we did in Iraq. And the intellectual dishonesty of this is just kind of breathtaking and exhausting to me, that, the same people who ignored Afghanistan for 8 years in order to surge in Iraq are now, saying all we have to do is surge in Afghanistan, ignoring both the ways that the two places are really different, and, frankly, the ways that Iraq, the violence got damped down for reasons that, and you and I have had this argument before, Eli, that were internal, that had a lot more to do with the Sunni sheikhs getting tired of Al-Qaeda and Al-Qaeda losing its domestic base, and that created the opening that then our troops were able to exploit. But somehow history's getting rewritten on the Sunday shows, and it's all about, if we only had another 40 or 50 or 60,000 troops.
Yeah, I don't think that's what it's really about.
No, of course not. It's about the 2010 midterm elections. None of this is actually about our incredibly important national security debates. It's all about partisan advantage.
I don't even think it's necessarily about partisan advantage. I mean, I'm prepared to make quips about, how the military has learned, the lessons of counterinsurgency, but the Democrats haven't. And I find it odd that progressives would be for de-escalation when the alternative is not peace in Afghanistan. It is drones that are likely to kill more civilians, which is an irony. I don't think quite grasped by some of the folks at Democracy's Arsenal, like Michael Cohen. But at the same time, I think that the issue is about the strategy. And I think what Petraeus, McChrystal, Mullen, and now more and more, I think, Gates is saying, and the most important thing, as I've reported on this, is that Obama needs to commit to the notion that in order to do counterterrorism, to root out the Taliban and Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, you need to do counterinsurgency, which is to protect and earn the trust of the population, which ought to be a principle embraced by national security liberals and national security neoconservatives alike. And it's certainly that was the strategy, which was far more important than the actual troop numbers for Iraq. And my understanding from sort of the military uniform side is that they can quibble. You can quibble, and the president ultimately has to make a decision about the number of American soldiers that are sent to the front. And these numbers, by the way, can be fudged with contractors, with other, supplement them with competent forces from other nations and so forth. What's more important is a commitment to the overall strategy, which is a commitment in time, and it's a commitment in some ways to, a very broad strategy that seeks to halt the momentum of the Taliban and strengthen alternative local institutions in Afghanistan. And of course, there's an Afghan context to that, but that strikes, and I think that that's the deeper question that's being hashed out right now in the White House.
Well, I have a new rule about this, actually, which is that any time anyone begins one of these discussions by sort of throwing in counterterrorism and counterinsurgency without defining what they mean, I sort of take off 10 points.
Well, I think I defined what it is. I mean, counterterrorism would be just targeting leaders, terrorist leaders, and counterinsurgency is a strategy that commits you to building these alternative local institutions, protecting the population, and ultimately leaving behind a stable alternative to the Taliban in this case. So
something that I think sort of all sides are guilty of in this discussion is making the decision that the president has to make out to be much more black and white than it actually is. It's not. The White House has made very clear that they're not going to go the pull all the troops out and just use drones. So that is just a straw man being put up by certain folks who want to make it look as if there's no alternative but a massive escalation. On the other hand, I think it's also clear that McChrystal's not getting all 60,000 of his troops, and that, frankly, Eli, you mentioned the time element, that nobody on the political side thinks that it's people on the substantive side maybe, but nobody on the political side thinks it's ultimately a good idea to commit to the kind of 10-year, hundreds of thousands of American troop strategy that would be necessary to do classical counterinsurgency the way it's written out in the manuals, where the troop to citizen ratio is so high and so on, because nobody thinks Americans have the stomach for that, and frankly, quite a few people are not sure it would work even if you did that. So then, the question that they're
10 years. I mean, I think I'm going to really dissent on that. 10 years. I mean, the idea is that you have a competent Afghan force that can steadily take over, and as we've seen in Iraq, you're able to leave areas where you couldn't leave in 06 and 07 and 08, and now they've left, and there's been relative stability, though Al-Qaeda still has an ability to do these sorts of devastating attacks, but nothing like they were able to do before.
So again, Eli, I mean, the debate is not over some grand counterinsurgency versus counterterrorism. The debate is, do we have 2 years? Do we have 4 years? Do we have 6 years? And then if however many years you think we have, what can you accomplish toward the counterinsurgency end that you sketched out? How much of Afghan institutions and what kind can we help stand up in whatever amount of time you think we have? And then what are the tools, both military and non-military, you need to accomplish that? And I think that's the debate that's going on. How much time do we have, and how much political capital is the administration willing to spend to buy 2 years or 4 years or 6 years? And that determines where you are on the spectrum between sort of full-on counterinsurgency operations. And that's it's a decision they have to make, both in terms of what their assessment of the situation on the ground is and what their assessment of how much political capital and human capital it's worth spending.
Well, I mean, further, I'd take a step back. I think that 2 months ago or 6 weeks ago, there really was a consideration of a kind of drone-only or drone-centric counterterrorism policy from General Joe Biden. And I think that largely, that approach, that lighter footprint, has been rejected, and now they're talking about the level of increase versus, and I think that, at least it seems that they've said publicly that they're not going to withdraw troops, and that was a straw man, but I think that was, at least if you're to believe some of the leaks from early September, a serious consideration. And, what I've heard is that when Obama went on Meet the Press and all the Sunday shows and said, we need to make sure we get our strategy right, that really ticked off the generals who believed that he had made this commitment to overall counterinsurgency back in March when, he had Bruce Riedel head up that policy review. And, obviously, the elections did not go very well. And there's ample evidence that Karzai probably stole a lot of the votes. And that's a problem. But they knew how corrupt he was before. And so it's sometimes it's hard to distinguish whether there were substantive reasons for kind of this massive rethink or whether there were political reasons, because I think that Democrats are very uncomfortable with making any kind of long-term commitment in Afghanistan. just as clearly they weren't comfortable making a long-term commitment in Iraq. So, I think that there is that, and I think that also Obama himself. I mean, he's the president, and at the end of the day, better for him now to either commit to Afghanistan or not than to kind of have half of, put a toe in the water but not be fully committed.
Well, again, I think that all or nothing approach is really not actually useful because it's not a choice that we have. And I think, the White House has been really clear on that there's no possibility of just walking away. So it's not as if you could actually choose to do that. And so just framing it as all or nothing is really unhelpful. And it's also, I know that a certain segment of the neoconservative folks are doing that for political gain, but it's actually not very helpful to them because the more you frame it as all or nothing, the more you drive the public toward nothing, actually. And I think that folks who have done that, John McCain, Lindsey Graham, the signers of the FBI letter, Karl Rove, Sarah Palin, as well as some actual serious national security minds who may genuinely believe that all in is what's needed. But I think in public, actually, they're having the opposite result from what they intend, which is that as the public hears, well, we have to have 10 years and 100,000 extra troops to make any difference. Well, then the hell with it. Let them stew in their own juices. So, I think...
What's the evidence of that? I don't know. And I've always thought that there was far less of a constituency for, allegedly progressive national security ideas than the progressive national security folks think there is. It's a volunteer army, Heather. It's not a draft.
Okay, so Eli, why are the numbers for Afghanistan plummeting in public? Why is the public so much less committed to it? Why do less than 50% of Americans think that it was justified in the first place? Which I think is deeply problematic, and all the progressives I know think is deeply problematic. But one of the things we absolutely know about public opinion is that if you only present people with unpalatable alternative, the neoconservative alternative doesn't sound palatable to anyone.
How is it not palatable? We have a volunteer army that
doesn't want to be there. Eli, if you go, it's just fascinating. I talked to political candidates quite a bit, and I was quite surprised. The last 3 or 4 folks from southern conservative states have all said, every event I do, the public is raising Afghanistan with me, and what they want to know is why are we there and how long are we going to be there? The public is tired. The military families, will go where they're told and do what they're told and believe in the mission, but they are tired and frustrated. And, again, so if you put it out there as, well, if we don't put in 100,000 more troops, this isn't going to be worth doing, then the public response is going to be, okay, then this isn't worth doing. And I think...
No one's saying 100,000 more troops.
First of all,
Who's saying 100,000 more troops?
Well, if you actually look at the classic counterinsurgency doctrine that you were citing so enthusiastically a while ago, we'd have to have several 100,000 troops in Afghanistan to meet.
But you're making a classic mistake, which is that it's not 100,000 American troops. It's the ratio accounts for competent troops that can kind of keep order. So that would include a segment of the Afghan army, which is not the whole Afghan army, that is competent or deemed competent. It would include NATO forces. It would include mercenaries / contractors. There's a whole bunch of ways to fill that number that is not necessarily going to be reflected in a troop increase of American troops.
Okay, and so finally, Eli, in the next year, you've got fewer than 20,000 Afghan troops you would put in that category. You've got the American troops that are there.
I don't know that it was.
You've got absolutely zero European countries, NATO members, that are willing to send more troops, and you've got, in fact, several national contingents.
The UK just agreed to a tiny surge, I think.
That are going to be right. Well, that won't even compensate for the departure of the Canadians. So that's a hell of a lot of mercenaries you've got to have to hire, and I don't foresee either public or financial support for. So it's just that
your notion. First of all, if Democrats would let McChrystal testify and make the case, or if Obama would make the case after this deliberation, I think that would have an effect on public opinion. And second of all, you have one of the most popular and widely respected generals in recent military history, in David Petraeus, that is for this strategy and believes that it can win the war in Afghanistan. And I think that for the people that matter most in this, which would be our soldiers, that's fairly significant. He's a very widely respected general.
Well, you've actually just importantly distorted one thing Petraeus said, which is he's been very clear to say this isn't about winning. He really, I think the military, not that this was their fault, but everybody learned their lesson with the whole victory, mission accomplished, and they've been very clear to say this isn't going to look like victory. This isn't going to look like winning. This isn't going to. So I think
we
distorting.
can have a semantic argument. I think Petraeus has also said that he thinks this is the best way to reverse the momentum of the Taliban in Afghanistan. And there, according to press leaks, I don't know, according to senior officials, I haven't, in my conversation with White House officials, they've never expressed this to me, but apparently there are people who are in this debate who are saying that there could be a difference, that it's not entirely clear that if the Taliban took over Afghanistan that Al-Qaeda would necessarily follow. And it's like, I mean, this is fairly dangerous if this is actually being taken seriously inside a discussion of Afghanistan. Of course, if the Taliban took over, that you would have more of a sanctuary than you already have in Pakistan for Al-Qaeda. And that has been, from the very beginning, if I may, a centrist Obama national security approach that has criticized the Iraq war not as an imperial venture, but rather as a distraction from what we should be focusing on, which is Al-Qaeda. And if he decides that, in some ways he's going to not comply with the request of his professionals, another big Democratic talking point during the Bush years, which is listen to your generals, listen to what they have to say, which is, of course, his right, but then I think he would be putting himself in a political risk. While certainly he would have the devotion of his progressive base, but I think he would be very much in danger of losing, I think, the strong center of the country.
Well, Eli, the thing that you keep leaving out of this discussion is that there's actually a very strong group of sort of realist centrists and independents and Republicans and national security professionals who say, number one, we can't actually achieve the counterinsurgency / nation building objectives. Right. And number two, that there's a sophisticated discussion that needs to be had about how strong Al-Qaeda is in Afghanistan, and not in the naive way of saying, Afghanistan could go back to the Taliban and everything would be fine, but sort of relatively speaking, if we make the mistake of putting all our anti-Al-Qaeda eggs in the Afghanistan basket, we ignore Somalia and Yemen and other places, we then remake the mistake that the Bush administration made by saying, we're going to fight Al-Qaeda in Iraq and ignoring it in Afghanistan. So was
it a mistake? Was it a mistake? I mean, Al-Qaeda was in Iraq and Bush fought them there, and they don't have a safe haven there anymore, but okay.
Well, they actually weren't in Iraq until we invaded Iraq, but
that's not necessarily true either. If you look at the actual Senate Select Committee,
they were not mounting
report.
Sophisticated operations from Iraq. They were not doing the kinds of training in Iraq that they're doing in Afghanistan and Pakistan.
USAID officer Lawrence Foley in Amman, Jordan, was killed by an assassin who was linked to the Zarqawi network. I mean, I don't know. Anyway, but go on.
Right. I mean, but if that was our criterion, again, you'd have to look Somalia, Yemen, Western Europe.
Well, I think there is an effort there. But are you proposing that we are going to devote military troop resources to Yemen and Somalia beyond the special forces and other things that we sort of have operating?
No, I'm proposing that actually there were much more efficient ways to handle the threat that was whatever threat there was in Iraq than what we actually did, which was sort of gross overkill that ultimately diverted us from other goals.
Well, I don't know what you're saying. I mean, you're saying that don't get it twisted that we're not going to remove any troops from Afghanistan. And so now we have this, pretty clear recommendation that there's 20, 40, 60 from McChrystal saying that these are the scenarios that we'd want and these are the kind of objectives we would want. And he obviously wants to augment that with other troops as well. Right. And, at this point, they're going to have to sort of work out what they're going to do. But if they give... what I've heard is that the most that Afghanistan, the real number is 25,000. That's the most that can be absorbed in Afghanistan in the next, 8 months or so. And then, they've averted the potential for reducing forces, which I think, at least my understanding was that was at least something that was being talked about, and now it's no longer on the table, which is a good thing, I suppose. And so it seems like, slowly but surely Obama is embracing, this notion. And then finally, is he going to second guess what his generals up and down are saying, and now apparently Gates and also Clinton are saying that should be the policy, which is that we should focus on trying to protect populations and setting up these alternative local institutions as a way of depriving the Taliban of, more territory. I mean, is he going to second guess that and saying, no, we shouldn't do that? I mean, it is, again, his right to do so. And these people aren't infallible, but...
I think actually the way you're discussing it is leaving out a big piece of the picture, which is that ultimately, as in Iraq, the one sort of core similarity that I'll grant you is that the core problem is political and not military. And the core problem of getting Afghanistan to a point where it can manage some kind of security equilibrium in which development and humanitarian needs can be met and within which Al-Qaeda can be marginalized and can be made less appealing to the population and separated out from the population, that's a political and civilian problem which has a military component rather than being primarily a military problem. So the strategic question that nobody ever talks about, because it's much sexier to talk about troop levels and because, of course, more Americans are implicated in that, so it's understandable that it dominates news coverage. But so the question is, what do we have to do to put the conditions in place for those political things to happen? What's the time frame for that? And then what's the security component that you need for that? And so what I also think that it's going to come out somewhere around that 25,000 number.
Okay.
But my assumption is, and what I think never gets covered and that there are intense debates on, but they're much harder to follow than, is it 10 or 20 or 40 or 60? So we don't hear about them so much, is what's the political, because we're also much deeper in the hole than we were 6 months ago. Not because, how can I put this? Not because anybody was surprised that Karzai was willing to steal an election to stay in power, apparently, but because there's no longer a path toward more legitimacy that Afghans can point to. So that's a really deep hole politically to have to climb out of, and frankly, it doesn't matter how many troops we have there. That doesn't help with that. So the core political challenge is how can you come to terms with that one way or another, and then flowing from that, and what do you think you're doing about that going forward, and what role do you think the international community has? What role does development have? What role does humanitarian efforts have? What role does political negotiations, splitting off pieces of the Taliban, negotiations with the neighbors? And then what role does security have? But the only piece that we're talking about is the troop piece.
No, I think, this whole conversation I'm talking about is strategy options. And, come on, you can say it's a straw man or not or whatever, but there was a serious consideration of what has been called this counterterrorism approach. That apparently has been cast aside. Well, we don't know because they haven't announced it, and they said they're still deliberating on these things. So, it could change with, whatever rumors going to be put out tomorrow. But again,
counterterrorism versus counterinsurgency is a subset of, if your core goal is, again, to create some modicum of, because Heather,
are you under the impression that you can do any of these political things without first achieving basic security?
I'm under the impression that you need to decide which things you need to do and then figure out how much security you need to establish to do them, and from that flow your troop numbers, not the other way around.
But the first thing in order to do any of this is that you have to eliminate the Taliban's ability in a local area to intimidate the local population and then turn the local population so they become your eyes and ears. Once we get that, then we can, and then from that stems everything else. That was what everyone was saying in Iraq: security this, security first. And in some ways, that's what happened. And that you mentioned this sort of political thing in Iraq, which is the Anbar awakening. And I think it's a mistake to say that this happened in the vacuum and had nothing to do with the surge, when in fact the beginnings of it.
It happened before the surge.
No. But this is a talking point, and it's largely false. Let me, if I can, tell you where I'd like to just correct the record. Yes. There was a rebellion against Al-Qaeda from some of the local tribes, but they were losing, and it didn't have any effect until more Marines went out to Western Iraq, and that's what these people, that's what the sheikhs of the awakening will tell you. I'm saying it's a nice progressive talking point to cover for the fact that the surge was opposed almost uniformly by Democrats, but it doesn't change the reality. Yes, there was always been resentment, and there's always been opposition to al-Qaeda, but al-Qaeda would win that contest without the infusion of troops into Iraq, and that's what happened.
I mean, actually, Eli, the way I would describe that history is that sheikhs came and asked for help and were rebuffed by Bush administration political and military leaders, and then luckily for us, sheikhs came and asked for help again and met a more receptive core of generals who had been moved in when the Bush administration moved to its somewhat less ideological phase of dealing with it.
They were rebuffed by General Casey when he was in charge of Iraq, because as it was seen at the time as red on red. And would it have been better to follow the advice of the local captains and people who were actually in the field at the time and to take, I guess now...
would it have been better not to de-Baathize and throw all those people out of power in the first place? Why, yes.
No, are you kidding? This is another big misconception. I mean, the way that de-Baathification was done with regards to the army, most people would say that was done very clumsily. But most of the de-Baathification or the notion, these people were not. I mean, are you under the impression that the Anbar awakening is largely former Ba'ath officials? I mean, that's just not right.
No, but it's a power vacuum which resulted from our unwillingness in the early days after the war to deal with traditional power structures, which is ironic given how up to our necks we are with horrifyingly corrupt and violent traditional power structures in Afghanistan. So you sort of, it's one extreme or the other, not to romanticize what we're doing in Afghanistan.
Well, I guess what I'm saying is that that the military affects all of those other things, and I think you're conceding the point, however reluctantly, that you would agree that you need to have. I mean, like you need to have the ability to provide security in order to get the negotiations that are political and about aid and development started, but you can't go in there and expect to do anything unless you have the firepower that can legitimately protect civilians.
Well, actually, Eli, I mean, this is a case where Iraq and Afghanistan are quite different, because in some parts of Afghanistan, you're right, but in large swaths of Afghanistan, you're not. And in Iraq, the political was going on simultaneously. When the administration finally decided to adopt a less ideological approach, the surge happened at the same time as there started to be serious negotiations with Iraq's neighbors and serious power-sharing talks in Baghdad.
How is it a less ideological? I don't want to belabor it. How is it a less ideological approach? When we've had these conversations for nearly 3 years.
We started talking to the Iranians, for example, that we finally picked up again the idea that the Iranians were going to have to be part of the solution.
And that had nothing to do, our talks went nowhere with the Iranians. We started killing the Iranians and arresting them and sending them to a ring of secret prisons where they were very likely tortured. That was a big part of the surge, which very few people talk about, but there's ample evidence for. And I'm going to Iraq in 3 weeks and hopefully going to be writing more about.
But interestingly, we were actually doing both of those things at the same time, and that was a core point of sending messages to the Iranians, which was to say there are ways that we will deal with you, and there are things that we will do with you, and there are other things we will not do with you and not tolerate, and we will respond in very violent ways. And we were, that's when the operation finally
Democrats freaked out when the Erbil 5 was originally detained and arrested. I mean, they thought it was an amazing provocation that would ruin the prospect of the talks in Baghdad. It turns out that probably gave us more leverage in the talks in Baghdad.
Eli, that's a very at any given time, there's probably some Democrat somewhere freaking out about something. So I'm just not even going to engage with that.
They passed a resolution that said no, you can't use it. Remember all these resolutions? I'm not. It's not one or two Democrats. It was the Democratic leadership that saw the initial thing. They said that they were extremely concerned about they wouldn't vote for just even non-binding resolutions that said the Iranians were meddling in Iraq. There was a huge debate over this. You don't remember any of this?
Not the way you're portraying it. No, I have great difficulty recognizing events the way you're portraying them. So look, on Afghanistan, what I think we've boiled down to, a core difference, which is that I say that you set the strategy that the military is one arm of it, and you have to be careful that it doesn't drive the others, and that we're too used to thinking through the prism you suggest, where the military has to come first. And I'm not saying the military doesn't have to be there, but there's a lot of pieces of this that you can sort out, or that you should sort out, without it being all about troop numbers. And I think that's our core difference in how we view the situation.
All right. Well, I mean, it seems like, I mean, I certainly agree with you that we need to have political and development and everything else like that. You seem to be embracing the notion, or at least the broad outlines of a kind of counterinsurgency approach. And I think that there's, I mean, it's almost like maybe we shouldn't be having this debate because we tend to sort of generally agree on the broad outlines of this, and maybe you should be having a debate with Michael Cohen. I mean, you know what I'm saying? I mean, there are progressives who are really just who want to de-escalate Afghanistan and are.
But there are conservatives who want to do that too. I mean, I'm kind of uninterested in attaching ideological labels to it at this point. And I don't know if you've seen, there are some fascinating, some Code Pink folks who just spent a week in Afghanistan and came back and said, oh, actually, we can't pull the troops out too quickly because we need them to help maintain the humanitarian situation. So you've now got. I mean, ideological labels are really distorting of the honest debate that needs to happen here. So I'm just.
Well, I'm sorry, but it's like I'm used to. I mean, I'm an independent thinker and a journalist first, so I don't really I'm not comfortable being in any kind of ideological corner. But there has been such a relentless and often false portrayal of neoconservatives and Bush administration conservatives over and over and over again, like a North Korean work song for the last 7 years, that I'm sorry, I feel that occasionally it's okay to criticize the other side of it.
Eli, I'm going to be so happy all day at the notion that you've compared my life's work to a North Korean work song. I can't even tell you how I'm going to get off Blogging Heads and call up everybody I know. And then I'm going to find a really good one and link it to this Blogging Heads.
All right. I'm not you, Heather. I'm not saying your life's work. I'm just saying, this notion, it's over and over and over again. And, so much of it. And it's not my job. I mean, I'm a reporter first, so I'm maybe not the best representative of the right on this. But it seems like, label for me, but not for thee. Or vice versa.
The reason I'm enjoying this so much is having spent the last 7 years of, when progressives complain about being caricatured and marginalized and whined about, we get a lot of, oh, poor you. And so I'm bemused to find myself in the reverse position, and all I can say to you, Eli, is I feel your pain. I've got 8 years worth of feeling your pain stored up. Anyway, do you want to talk about the Goldstone report?
Actually, I do want to talk about it, but can we go to, because actually we can pivot to a less contentious discussion about Iran very quickly. Because I want to actually, and this time, dear viewer, I'm very serious in that I think I've thought this through on just an approach to Iran policy that I actually think I may gain your ascendance on, Heather. You ready?
You think I'm going to agree with you? Whatever you say, I'm going to oppose it, but go ahead.
Okay, fair enough. Well, here's my idea. Here's a thought, okay? Just a thought. It's just amusing, okay?
A modest proposal from Eli Lake.
Not like the Jonathan Swift variety. But anyway, our Iranian posture should be more Iranian. And what do I mean by that? We are going to negotiate with, we're negotiating right now with the Iranians. I don't, based on what Iranian officials say about those negotiations, they're very different than what the U.S. officials say has been agreed. And I think that anybody looking at this would have to be cynical or pessimistic or skeptical, at least, of the prospect the Iranians would want to give up their nuclear weapon. We also, as an intelligence reporter, not just me, David Sanger, and lots of people have reported on efforts to sabotage the Iranian nuclear program, which my understanding is that Obama has continued, though of course doesn't talk about, nor should he talk about. And finally, there is a green movement and opposition that is easier to sort of get a channel to than other things. Anyway, like the Iranians who negotiate with us and have people like Javad Zarif and other diplomats who kind of make them seem very reasonable, while they also have their Qasem Soleimanis who do all kinds of nasty stuff to our soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan, and who also support Hezbollah and other groups that sort of align with their national interest and ideological agenda. We should be simultaneously appearing to want to only negotiate with them, and we should try to send people out, our most supine ambassadors and diplomats, to make it seem like we're just out to clear this misunderstanding up, this 30-year misunderstanding up, while intensifying intelligence operations to kidnap their scientists, sell them modified equipment, cause industrial accidents in their nuclear labs, and so forth. And develop a discrete channel to the opposition and basically kind of try to calibrate our policy in terms of what helps or hurts the opposition, but, on their terms. You know what I'm saying? I don't want to prejudge. I could see them arguing it both ways. So the bottom line, the watchword, Heather, and I just want to get your thoughts on this, U.S. policy to Iran should be more Iranian. Remember, the Iranians had an embassy in Baghdad for the entire Iran-Iraq war. And the entire time, they used to put out all this stuff like, oh, they're peaceful, it's just a big misunderstanding. Meanwhile, they would be sending 12-year-olds to clear minefields and suicide bombers and the rest. And I'm not saying we should have suicide bombers, but I'm just saying we should be completely nasty in the covert kind of dark side of the war, the sabotage war against their nuclear program, while appearing to be incredibly reasonable and only interested in diplomacy.
Well, Eli, I'm having trouble hearing you over the North Korean work song blaring through the loudspeakers here.
Oh, I'm sorry. I started chewing my thumb again.
But I mean, there's two points about that, and one is that it's definitely true that American engagement with the world sometimes lacks a certain sense of sophistication and multi-texturedness. But at the same time, it's what makes us who we are, that we don't send 12-year-olds to clear minefields.
No, obviously, we're not going to do that.
And we certainly do sometimes say one thing and do another, but we're not actually we don't do it very well, frankly, compared to other cultures, because we do it. I don't want to pretend that we don't, but we're not actually comfortable with it. We're not, at a public level, comfortable with that being part of our arsenal. So, I would hate for us to get too comfortable with it, although you could certainly make the argument that we are, and you could name off various episodes in our history. But just the last point I want to make is we actually have a wonderful good cop, bad cop situation going on in the person of the U.S. Congress, which is steaming full ahead on its gasoline sanctions. And Eli, on that note, I'm afraid that I actually have to wrap up.
Okay.
Because the dear leader is reminding me that I have another meeting in 10 minutes. So we're going to have to hold the Goldstone report for next time, by which time, who knows, the U.S. may have issued its first veto over it at the Security Council.
Yes.
Or the Human Rights Commission in the meantime. So delightful arguing with you.
But how is it just one clarification point? You would continue the sabotage programs against Iran's nuclear program?
I couldn't possibly discuss that, Eli, because it would require acknowledging their existence. We're
not in government. I mean, if you were a government official, I'm just saying, but you don't have a problem with that, right?
Yeah, no, you got to use all the tools. You got to use all the tools you have.
Exactly. So you see what I'm saying? Like, ninja assassins on the one hand, and then Dennis Ross or William Burns on the other.
I draw the line at assassins, and I actually thought you did too. But we can go back. You
draw the line at assassins. If you could kill Ayman Zawahiri, you wouldn't do it.
Killing Zawahiri is different from killing Iranian nuclear scientists. Actually,
no, I wouldn't kill an Iranian nuclear scientist. I would kill Iranian Quds Force guys, but that's a separate question. Okay.
No, I mean, assassinations should have to be personally approved by the president, and there should have to be very clear, defensible evidence that you're saving more lives than you're taking.
What about kidnapping scientists?
And, by the way, this is ridiculous. You can't kidnap all of the brain power in Iran's nuclear program. I mean, I think it's a little bit of a fantasy.
I think some of them may have already been kidnapped.
Yes, I've seen that, or defected on their own. By the way,
or defected on their own. Yeah, who is to say?
Where that
who is to say?
Yeah,
who is to say? It was just an industrial fire. Who is to say?
Right.
Okay.
Okay, Eli. Talk to you soon.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Good stuff. Bye bye.